At dawn, a foreign demand landed like a blade across the map of Africa. 48 hours, they said. Hand over 60% of Burkina Faso's gold and oil, or lose the keys to the dollar system. No debate, no dialogue. Only a countdown written in dollars and threats. By nightfall, a reply emerged, not in whispers, but in law. Ibrahim Traoré signed a decree that turned the tables. 72 hours, he declared. Either the companies comply with the nation's rules, or the fields, the wells, and the mines would be closed. No carve-outs, no extensions. 2 clocks began to tick. One was backed by Washington's financial machinery. The other by a landlocked nation's will to defend its soil. Between them lay not only resources, but the meaning of sovereignty itself. Would Burkina Faso collapse under the weight of 48 hours, or would it rise taller after 72? Do not look away. What comes next may change how we read the map. Subscribe and stay with us, because this is not a headline. It is a turning point. The order from Washington was simple in language, but brutal in impact. 48 hours, 60% of Burkina Faso's gold and oil, or the gates of the dollar system would slam shut. It was not a negotiation, not even a request. It was a dictate, a reminder of how financial power can be wielded like a weapon. The message traveled across oceans and arrived in Ouagadougou with the weight of history, as if centuries of extraction could be condensed into 2 days of ultimatum. Yet the response was neither silence nor concession. Ibrahim Traoré, a young leader already known for refusing to bow to external dictates, answered with his own line in the sand. 72 hours. The nation's resources would henceforth move under the authority of Burkina Faso. Companies could sign new agreements, or their fields, pipelines, and mines would be suspended. This was not a bluff, for the groundwork had already been laid months before. Military privileges granted to foreign powers had been rolled back. Mining contracts were re-examined. Non-compliant operators were removed. Oversight of exports was centralized, and data servers controlling mining operations were pulled under state authority. The switches were not theoretical. They had already been flipped. The confrontation was visible from the first hour. In banks, test transfers stalled as systems probed the reach of the American order. Trucks at checkpoints stood idle, drivers waiting for documents to be revised in line with the new directives. In the ministries, security briefings moved behind closed doors, with lists of potential saboteurs circulated among officers. In boardrooms, lawyers drafted exit strategies for companies unwilling to comply. It was not theater. It was a collision between law and leverage, sovereignty and dependence. Inside the capital, the control room became the heart of this experiment. Large clocks were mounted on the walls, one marking Washington's 48 hours, the other counting down Traoré's 72. As the hands moved, every decision became a test. Export freezes were ordered, mines were audited. Foreign security was replaced by national forces. Couriers carried sealed packets to mining headquarters across the country. Some managers complied quietly, handing over access codes and updating records. Others resisted, refusing to surrender server keys or attempting to move stockpiles before inspections. At one site, drones swept the perimeter, documenting every truck and shipment. A convoy that tried to slip past at dusk was stopped cold, its papers declared invalid. It was escorted back under armed guard. The order was precise. Burkina Faso was not seizing private equipment, nor was it blocking safe operations. But the rules had changed. Compliance was no longer optional. For the first time in decades, the nation's natural wealth was not being dictated abroad, but administered under its own authority. That reality, enforced hour by hour, gave the 72-hour order its gravity. For ordinary people, The tension was tangible. Radios in markets and bus stops repeated updates every hour. Courtyard discussions circled around the two clocks. The question was the same. Would the nation bend to the foreign demand, or would it make its own ultimatum real? Villagers guarded depots overnight. Miners held meetings on whether to continue operations, and engineers improvised surveillance systems using commercial drones to create a live warning grid. Each measure, however modest, was a signal. The people were not passive observers. They were participants in the countdown. Yet even in the early hours, pressure mounted. At a fuel depot, a fire broke out, later confirmed as sabotage. Inside government offices, 2 officials were dismissed after suspicious transfers linked them to the foreign demand. Convoys stalled at checkpoints, caught between expired contracts and the new rules. The system was under strain, but it did not crack. If anything, resilience sharpened. Reports flowed into the control room. 2 foreign operators signed immediately. Another hesitated, while one threatened withdrawal. The map of compliance was marked in green, yellow, and red. Green for compliance, yellow for review, red for resistance. Slowly, the red patches shrank. Still, the question loomed larger than the daily reports. This was not only about gold shipments or oil wells. It was a test of whether a landlocked nation could enforce sovereignty in the face of financial warfare. Could a country, often dismissed as peripheral, declare rules that multinationals and even superpowers were forced to respect? Could the soil of Burkina Faso, so often dug up for others' gain, finally become the ground on which dignity was planted? The 2 clocks ticked in opposite directions, each second tightening the tension. Washington's 48 hours promised paralysis. Traoré'S 72 promised rebirth. Which would strike first? Which would shatter? By the 20th hour, the strain was no longer abstract. Banks had frozen small test transfers. Cash flows slowed. Trucks sat idle at checkpoints, engines humming in frustration. But alongside this paralysis came resilience. Miners guarded stockpiles through the night. Village elders coordinated with radio operators, opening community channels for real-time alerts. Young engineers, lacking satellites, converted consumer drones into a makeshift surveillance grid. The system was rough, improvised, and fragile, yet it worked. Dots of green, yellow, and red lit up on maps inside the control room, showing compliance, hesitation, and resistance. At the 32nd hour, panic swept through the ministries. Confirmation arrived that test transfers routed through New York were blocked. The foreign ultimatum was no longer a threat on paper. It was machinery in motion. No trucks meant no exports. No exports meant no revenue. And no revenue meant the lifeblood of the state was being choked. Inside the control room, silence fell. For decades, access to the dollar had been treated as oxygen. Now the supply was cut. This was the moment Washington had prepared for. The strike point designed to break a fragile economy before the 72-hour order could root itself. But Ibrahim Traoré did not fold. He ordered backup systems activated. Sahel banks were tapped for regional settlements. Barter agreements were rushed into place. Gold was pledged for supply swaps. These were blunt, clumsy tools, but they kept oxygen flowing. For the first time, the nation attempted to breathe without the dollar. It was survival in borrowed air, but it was survival nonetheless. At the 45th hour, tension reached the streets. Foreign broadcasters declared that Burkina Faso had been cut off from the financial system. Local radio insisted the transition to state control was intact. Shopkeepers stacked smaller piles of currency. Truckers sat on idling engines. Families queued longer for fuel. Every voice, every rumor circled back to the 2 clocks. 48 hours, 72 hours. Which would strike first? Hour 47. brought a brutal report. Payment channels were confirmed frozen. 2 foreign operators announced withdrawal. Sabotage attempts were under investigation. Yet there were also flashes of resilience. Domestic banks processed regional trades. Gold swaps were honored through Sahel partners. Villages themselves guarded depots at night. The system, though battered, held. Then came the first sign of reversal. A courier delivered news that the People's Resource Fund had received a direct gold deposit, bypassing blocked wires. Cheers erupted in the control room. It was not salvation, but it was proof that another artery could be opened. By the 50th hour, the standoff became visible worldwide. Foreign media outlets ran headlines of collapse. Markets speculated against the currency, and traders whispered of default. In Ouagadougou, the pain was real. Food prices rose. Taxi drivers refused long trips, fearing fuel shortages. Yet inside the control room, Traoré remained steady. He ordered the resource fund to release emergency stipends to miners, not in block dollars, but in gold-backed credits valid locally. Western outlets mocked the move as primitive. But in mining towns, the response was different. Workers held pay slips and said, "At least we are still working." The blunt tool restored calm where unrest might have erupted. Hour 57 brought a new drama. A sabotage team was caught, attempting to tamper with a power substation. Images of their arrest, tied to contractors already under suspicion, spread across the capital. For the first time, sabotage was not rumor. It was visible and punishable. Applause broke out in markets, cautious but real. In the control room, advisors debated whether to offer relief to companies resisting compliance or to let them collapse. Traoré cut the debate short. "This is a test of sovereignty," he declared. "If they cannot operate under our law, they will not operate here." His words were broadcast across tea shops and bus stops. A declaration that the countdown was no longer about contracts, but about dignity. Then came the turning point. At dawn on the 60th hour, the world expected collapse. Foreign analysts predicted a run on reserves. Headlines framed Burkina Faso as a state on the brink. But instead of silence, convoys rumbled across the borders. Mali and Niger announced a joint guarantee, a shield of grain, fuel, and medicine. Trucks rolled into markets, hospitals, and depots under escort, horns blaring. Villages cheered. Cameras captured Traoré, standing shoulder to shoulder with Sahel leaders at the frontier, watching the first convoy cross. No speeches, no banners, just presence. The image was enough. What was once portrayed as a lonely standoff was now seen as a regional stand. Would the 48-hour cutoff strangle the nation, or would the 72-hour order, backed now by neighbors, bend the future in Burkina Faso's favor? By the time the 60th hour struck, the tension had moved beyond control rooms and board meetings. It was felt in the lives of ordinary citizens. In the markets of Ouagadougou, shopkeepers raised prices overnight. Taxi drivers cut their routes short, worried that fuel would vanish before sunrise. Families queued for bread and grain, clutching smaller stacks of cash. Each transaction carried the shadow of the countdown. It was no longer theory, it was survival. Yet even as hardship spread, so too did resilience. Domestic banks, though strained, began to route trades through Sahel partners. Grain convoys from Mali and Niger arrived, stabilizing food supplies. Villages organized night patrols around depots, armed with little more than torches and determination. Engineers kept drones circling, their live feeds marking red zones of resistance, yellow patches of hesitation, and green areas of compliance. What began as a state decree had become a collective discipline, enforced by people who refused to let their sovereignty collapse with a clock. The political consequences were equally sharp. 2 officials had already been dismissed for suspicious transfers linked to the foreign demand. Investigations traced sabotage attempts to contractors tied to external actors. For a state long accused of weakness, the purge signaled something new. Authority willing to act decisively against betrayal. Public trust, often fragile, began to strengthen. Citizens saw that corruption could be punished, that sabotage could be stopped, and that government orders were more than empty words. The message was clear. Sovereignty was not a slogan, but a system of accountability. Still, the foreign pressure bit deep. Frozen transfers meant delayed wages for thousands. Some companies resisted compliance, gambling on Washington's 48-hour strike to rescue their contracts. Traders speculated against the national currency. Headlines abroad framed the crisis as the beginning of collapse. Yet on the ground, the story diverged. In the mining towns, emergency stipends arrived, not in dollars, but in gold-backed credits valid within the local economy. Miners, though skeptical at first, accepted the slips as proof that their work still mattered. "At least we are still working," one said. That single phrase carried more weight than a dozen foreign headlines. The larger impact was psychological. For decades, citizens had been told that without external aid and the dollar system, the nation could not stand. Now, in the heat of crisis, they saw the opposite. They witnessed a government refusing to fold, neighbors providing support, and communities protecting their own assets. In that fragile but functioning reality, a seed was planted. The seed of anti-colonial Africa. If Burkina Faso, landlocked and small, could survive 48 hours of economic warfare, what stopped other nations from trying? If sovereignty could be defended not with tanks, but with law, networks, and regional solidarity, what excuse remained for silence? Political discourse sharpened. Radio hosts posed the question daily: if one small nation can, why not the rest? Tea shops buzzed with debates about whether Burkina Faso had opened a new chapter or simply postponed collapse. Some feared retaliation. Others saw only opportunity. For the ruling council, the lesson was immediate. Dependency was the enemy. Resilience, the only defense. The crisis had stripped away illusions. Aid that arrived with conditions was no gift. It was leverage. True partnership could only be built on dignity and self-control. Yet sovereignty carried risks. With foreign operators leaving, production slowed. With financial flows blocked, the state faced real shortages. The coming weeks would test whether resilience could outlast scarcity. Still, even in this fragility, a sense of pride emerged. Burkinabe citizens began to say aloud what had once been whispered: "Our gold is ours. Our oil is ours. Our land is ours." It was not a declaration of victory, but of intent. A refusal to return to silence. The 72-hour order thus reshaped politics. It exposed corruption, tightened national authority, redefined contracts, and forced citizens into the role of guardians. It revealed the costs of independence, but also its rewards. The struggle was raw, imperfect, and ongoing. But it was theirs. That truth, more than the outcome of any single ultimatum, marked a turning point. As the nation approached the final stretch of the countdown, one question echoed louder than all others. If Burkina Faso could endure, what stopped Africa itself? Could this fragile stand in Ouagadougou become the first spark in a wider fire of sovereignty? Or would the foreign pressure tighten until the experiment cracked? When the clocks struck their final hours, would Burkina Faso's defiance become the foundation of a continent's rebirth, or a cautionary tale of fragile resistance? As the countdown unfolded in Ouagadougou, the ripples were felt far beyond its borders. In Washington, the 48-hour ultimatum was framed as a test case, a demonstration that the dollar system was not optional. That defiance would be punished swiftly and visibly. American officials insisted the cutoff was necessary to preserve financial integrity, but few doubted the deeper motive. Control of gold and oil was leverage, and leverage was power. For the first time in years, however, that power faced resistance not from a rival superpower, but from a small, landlocked nation. In European capitals, reactions were cautious. Some policymakers echoed Washington's line, labeling Burkina Faso a high-risk environment. Yet behind closed doors, concerns grew. If financial sanctions could be resisted with barter systems, regional currencies, and gold swaps, what would stop other African states from following suit? Traders in London and Paris watched nervously as the Sahel convoys crossed into Burkina Faso, realizing that markets could no longer assume dependency as a given. The narrative shifted. What was once portrayed as isolation now appeared as alignment. Regional institutions faced their own dilemmas. The African Union issued standard calls for dialogue, wary of siding too openly in a contest with global powers. ECOWAS, often criticized for aligning with external interests, remained largely silent. But in Bamako and Niamey, silence was not an option. Mali and Niger, already locked in their own battles over sovereignty, threw their weight behind Burkina Faso. Their convoys of grain, fuel, and medicine were more than humanitarian aid. They were declarations of unity. Together, the three nations framed themselves as the Sahel bloc, a shield against external dictates. This solidarity reverberated across the continent. In Ghana, Kenya, and South Africa, commentators debated whether Burkina Faso had cracked open the door to a new financial order. Could Africa's wealth finally be traded without the mediation of distant capitals? Could the dream of African sovereignty move from slogans into systems? Foreign analysts, accustomed to predicting collapse, were forced to revise their models. They admitted that the 48-hour ultimatum had not broken Burkina Faso. It had forged a precedent, yet the pressure remained real. Payment systems were blocked, foreign operators withdrew, and traders speculated against the currency. But the image of Ibrahim Traoré, standing alongside Sahel leaders at the border, carried more weight than balance sheets. It told the world that sovereignty could be defended through regional cooperation. It told Africa that dependency was not destiny. The question was no longer whether Burkina Faso would survive 72 hours. It was whether outside powers could afford a confrontation with a region united by necessity, and whether that unity would spread beyond the Sahel. When the 72nd hour struck, the streets of Ouagadougou did not fall silent. They erupted. Radios blared victory songs, children waved flags, and markets reopened with a sense of defiance. The 48-hour ultimatum had passed into noise. What remained was a law written not by distant capitals, but by the Burkinabe themselves. Yet in truth, the clock had not ended the struggle. It had only reset it. The countdown was over. But the long journey of sovereignty had just begun. The path ahead is steep. The departure of foreign operators means production gaps. Sanctions and speculation will continue to squeeze the economy. The dollar channels remain blocked, making every transaction a negotiation. In this fragile environment, even small shocks, a drought, a fuel shortage, a cyber attack, could destabilize the gains. The risks are undeniable, and yet opportunity lies in the very fragility. By necessity, Burkina Faso has begun to sketch alternatives. Barter routes through Sahel banks, regional settlement in local currencies, emergency credits backed by gold. These are not yet polished systems. They are clumsy, costly, and prone to disruption. But they are seeds, planted in rocky soil, showing that trade can exist without chains of dependency. If nurtured, they could grow into the foundation of a new financial independence. The political path is no less critical. Traoré's government has shown it can act decisively, purging corrupt officials, enforcing compliance, and rallying communities. The challenge will be to sustain this resolve beyond crisis. Sovereignty is not a decree signed once. It is a discipline maintained daily. It requires transparent governance, honest leadership, and accountability to the very miners, farmers, and families who stood guard through the night. If trust is broken, the foundation of independence will crack from within. The future of the Sahel bloc also hangs in the balance. The convoys from Mali and Niger flip the narrative from isolation to solidarity. But will that unity hold under longer pressure? Will other African nations dare to join? Or will they retreat into safer alignments with global powers? The 72-hour standoff has shown that sovereignty defended together is stronger than sovereignty defended alone. The coming years will test whether the shield of the Sahel can expand into a wider continental framework. For ordinary citizens, the road is uncertain. Prices may rise, jobs may falter. External pressure will not vanish overnight. Yet a deeper shift has taken place. People have seen that dependency is not inevitable. They have felt what it means to stand on their own soil, guarding what is theirs, even under siege. That taste of dignity is difficult to erase. The countdown may have ended, but the question remains: will Burkina Faso's 72 hours be remembered as a fleeting act of defiance, or as the dawn of a new chapter where sovereignty becomes not theory, but practice across a continent still wrestling with its future? 72 hours. That was the measure of time given for a small nation to choose between submission and defiance. And when the final second passed, Burkina Faso did not collapse. It stood. Wages were paid in gold-backed credits. Grain convoys rolled through markets. Villagers guarded depots with pride. What was supposed to be a countdown to defeat became a lesson in endurance, dignity, and resolve. The foreign 48-hour ultimatum was designed to break a state. Instead, it revealed the birth of a new order. For Ibrahim Traoré and his people, those 3 days were more than survival. They were a declaration that resources, laws, and futures would no longer be dictated abroad. They showed that sovereignty is not theory, but action, enforced hour by hour, defended by communities and reinforced by solidarity. Around the world, analysts now debate the meaning of this confrontation. Was it only a temporary reprieve, or the spark of a wider movement? Across the Sahel, the answer feels tangible. The shield of Mali and Niger proved that unity can blunt sanctions. And across Africa, voices whisper the same question: if Burkina Faso could endure, why not us? If this stand could ignite the fire of anti-colonial Africa, what might a continent united by dignity achieve? The lesson is not only for governments. It is for citizens, for workers, for families who refuse to bow. The power of African sovereignty does not rest in speeches or treaties alone. It rests in the willingness to guard fields, to reroute trade, to build systems even when fragile, and to insist that dignity is worth the struggle. This was never just about gold or oil. It was about who decides. For 72 hours, the answer came not from abroad, but from the soil of Burkina Faso. And that answer now echoes beyond borders. The countdown has ended, but the story of anti-colonial Africa has only begun. If this story resonates with you, do not turn away. Share it, subscribe,